Hey everybody, this is a quick snapshot video on economies and diseconomies of scale. And as you can see, I've got a diagram there again, costs against output, and I've drawn the envelope curve, otherwise known as the long run average cost curve of production. Now, I will explain how the LRAC is derived in another video, than the next video, but for now, we just want to establish how this diagram can show economies and diseconomies of scale and the variation of these diagrams that you may see in an exam or may want to draw for your exams. Okay, so economies of scale essentially is the cost advantages of a very large firm, okay? The cost advantages that they can gain from being huge. And you have to know that the types of economies of scale that exist. So there's 6 or 7 different types. One of them, the most popular and common one, is bulk buying discounts. Okay, purchasing economies of scale, which essentially means that the bigger you are as a firm, the greater ability you have to buy in bulk and therefore receive huge discounts, which then basically means that your cost of production falls because you're accessing these materials at a much lower price. So on this diagram here, how do we show the economies of scale? Well, a diagram like this, which is quite a sharp U shape, what you need to do is find where costs are lowered up until the point where it reaches something called the minimum efficient scale. So if we split this up, which is a good idea, through an equilibrium, we want to go through the trough. Okay, and now you can see a clear distinction between the diagrams where you have cost decreasing up to a certain point and then cost increasing up to a certain point from where I've just highlighted that equilibrium. Okay, so we can just label that with a circle for now. Therefore, if costs are falling, okay, as output is rising up until point Q, this side of the diagram becomes known as economies of scale, okay, otherwise known as increasing returns to scale. Okay, increasing returns to scale. On the other side of the diagram, you can see that as you continue to expand and get bigger in size and continue to produce more, costs now start to rise. Okay, and again, this is referred to as the diseconomies of scale, or we know it as decreasing returns to scale. Now, in terms of explaining the theory, quite simply, as I've already said so, bulk buying would mean that firms are able to purchase goods and services at large volumes at low prices or low costs, and therefore their unit cost goes down and they can gain from EOS. Now, when a firm continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger, this can cause issues. Some of the issues include the management of employees, because it's just got now, the factory's got too big and there's too many workers there. It could include, most likely, coordination and communication problems for diseconomies of scale. And that would mean that costs then again start to rise as output starts to go up. Okay, and those costs mean that this firm is starting to become productively inefficient due to the fact that it's not managing workers properly, and there's communication issues, and therefore there is some inefficiencies occurring. Okay, so if we just note that down, so for diseconomies of scale, we're just saying that there are some coordination and communication issues, okay, and there may also be some management issues, and these can cause diseconomies of scale. And for economies of scale, we mentioned bulk buying as an example. However, there are other types of economies of scale that you should memorize for your exam and apply to this diagram. So things like the financial economies of scale, marketing, networking, containerization. These are all types of economies of scale that big firms can benefit from. Financial, for example, very quickly, is where large firms can easily access very large loans from banks at low interest because they're risk averse. Okay, banks are confident that big firms like Sainsbury's and Tesco's and Carrefour and Monoprix can pay back large sums of money because they are established existing firms, so they're risk averse. However, a smaller chain or a smaller shop, a local newsagent or a paper shop, for example, who wants to borrow large amounts of money or any money from a bank, banks may not lend at all to these firms because they're not risk averse and they're quite small and quite risky. If they do lend, they will lend at very high interest rates, which means that costs go up. So, use these examples in application for the diagram. Finally, I want to highlight something called the minimum efficient scale, the MES. Now, the minimum efficient scale of production is where the internal economies of scale have fully been exploited. So therefore, what we're saying is that this is corresponding to the lowest point on the long run average cost curve diagram. And you can see that at that point, where I've highlighted it in white just here, okay, the cost is at its lowest possible cost at that level of output. So we can also say for the MES, at that point, it is productively efficient. In essence, firms want to achieve economies of scale because they gain so highly from it in terms of a reduction in cost. You could then add, for example, that with the reduction in costs, we know that profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost. So if we're getting lower and lower unit costs, okay, this figure here, the total cost figure, is starting to fall, which then means that this figure here for profit is starting to go up. So therefore, having economies of scale and utilizing it and exploiting it means that large businesses continue to make excessive amounts of supernormal profit. You can also draw these curves in different ways as well. And one curve that I want to quickly highlight to you is another economies of scale diagram, but it's referred to as a bucket diagram. So cost against output. And so what you have now is something like this. Now, clearly, this is the long run average cost curve, but it looks different. It's a bucket diagram. And in terms of splitting it up, we have economies of scale occurring just through there. So this side of the diagram where costs are falling, okay? We have diseconomies of scale occurring here where where it starts to rise again, okay? So where the costs start to rise again. And in between, so let's just label that. So diseconomies of scale occur here, economies of scale occur on this side of the diagram, so Q and Q1. Now in the middle, where you have this kind of constant, no change in cost, what we call this is constant returns to scale. And you can see that's very different to the previous diagram. Now, with constant return to scale, this is a bit more realistic. And what we're saying here is that firms are able to enjoy for a longer period of time and quantity the gains from economies of scale. So if we're identifying the MES would just be here because it's the first part of the lowest cost that's achieved at in the diagram. And then the constant returns to scale, which is the line going from Q to Q1, the constant line. Well, you can see that the business there is producing more output and the cost is not changing. So the benefit derived from the economies of scale continues for a period of time. If we compare that to the original diagram that I drew, which is not a bucket diagram, so this diagram here, as soon as you reach the MES, so I've highlighted that in yellow now, okay, the next unit sold starts to increase cost and you run straight into diseconomies of scale. So you could argue in the real world, a bucket diagram applies and is more realistic. Finally, please remember that economies of scale diagrams based on what you're trying to show in your exam can be drawn in any way. If you're just trying to show economies of scale, you are allowed to just do this, okay? And that would be labeled as LRAC. So you're showing only EOS there. If you're trying to show only DOS, okay, in an exam, well then you can do this. Just make sure you always label it as LRAC, and then this shows clearly diseconomies of scale. Okay, so I just wanted to add that. I hope that helps with understanding economies, diseconomies of scale diagrams, and the minimum efficient scale